Welcome to this session of Family Communication. In this session, we begin talking about the research into marital communication, specifically what contributes to satisfying and successful relationships between spouses. At the outset, we have to make a couple of observations. First of all, remember the tension between idiosyncrasy and universality. Universality refers to the idea that research has identified a set of common characteristics that, when they are present, contribute to the relative satisfaction and success of marriages. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that every couple is different, and what might be successful for one couple might not be successful for another. After all, we're talking about human beings, and whenever you talk about human beings, it's necessarily complicated. Second, remember that communication is just one of several other factors that contribute to the relative health and success of any marriage. You may have heard it said, for example, that communication is the key to marriage. And while that's true, the reality is a bit more complex. In fact, in any given marriage, the extent to which communication contributes to the success or failure of that marriage might in fact vary. And so with these two things to consider, let's plunge into the research on marital communication. The project principally is to identify from the research what contributes to a healthy, successful, and satisfying marriage. And in that regard, multiple communicative endeavors have been identified that we can certainly say contribute to the health and success of a particular marriage. Let's start with this. One of the things we understand is that communication more often is the cause of marital success or unsuccess rather than it is a reflection of that marriage. In other words, how a husband and wife communicate is more likely to cause marital satisfaction than it is that in, let's say, an unhappy marriage, people are likely to communicate a particular way. Or to put it differently, if asking the question, well, which came first, the poor communication or the poor quality of the marriage, most of the research would suggest that the poor communication comes first. Also related to that, we have to understand that expectations play a significant role in the relationship between spousal communication and marital satisfaction and success. So, for example, if a wife has this expectation that her husband will share everything with her and that he will always be there for her and provide the kind of support for her that she needs at exactly the right moment, well, if the husband doesn't do that, then the wife is almost inevitably going to be let down. And so, therefore, we might conclude, at least from the wife's perspective, that she and her husband have poor communication. And so if those expectations are changed, then we might also change the conclusion and say, well, they have good communication. And so we always have to balance expectation against reality when it comes to any kind of marital communication. Two other ideas that are related to the relationship between marital communication and marital satisfaction and success is the notion of windows and the notion of development. Here's what we mean by that. A developmental pattern is this idea that says that how a couple communicates will develop over a period of time. And that development occurs, in fact, before people ever get married. Imagine a boy and a girl that are dating, and that are then engaged, and that are ultimately married. So the patterns of communication that these two fall into begin during that dating period. It's not like they change magically just because they happen to be married. In fact, much research finds that there are many kinds of communication between husbands and wives that actually began much earlier in the history of the romantic relationship. One example of that goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago about how the wife expected a certain kind of support to come from her husband. Research finds that the communication of support, which we'll talk about in greater detail in a few moments, is one of the kinds of communication that occurs very early on in a romantic relationship's history. So, in this particular example, while the woman and the man were dating, the man was already establishing a pattern of how and when and where he would provide the support that his beloved desires. Similarly, the female in this example is already accepting or not accepting the kind of support that the man in her life is giving her. And so, developmentally, what we say is that there is this pattern that occurs oftentimes long before marriage, which of course influences the communication that occurs in a marriage. So the developmental idea is a long-term type of a thing. Opposite of that is what's been called a window kind of motif or a window kind of pattern. And the idea behind a window pattern is that there are certain time periods that open up like a window when communication could change or when communication becomes first important. So, for example, in the research, one of the things we find is that oftentimes once people are married, a spouse will feel caught in the middle between his or her parents and his or her spouse. So imagine a woman who is in her first year of marriage, and she very much wants to go to spend the Christmas holidays with her biological parents. However, the husband also would like to spend time with his biological parents over the Christmas holiday, and in fact, his mother has very strong views about whether or not her son and his new wife will join them for Christmas. Well, as you might imagine, the son could feel caught in the middle between his wife's desires to spend Christmas with her side of the family and his mother's desires that he and his wife spend Christmas with them. So this caught in the middle may not have happened, or at least didn't happen in the same way prior to the time that they were married. So now, in this first year of marriage, this first Christmas together, a window has opened up that allows the two of them to have to communicate about this. So that sense of being caught in the middle leads to a certain kind of communication. And so that's an example of how this window pattern oftentimes animates a lot of what happens between spouses. And it makes sense that it would be this way, because as your roles change from dating to engaged to spouse, you would expect a concurrent change in communication. And so along the way, as we talk about different factors that influence marital communication, we'll occasionally pause and recognize this one's a developmental pattern, or this one's a window pattern, or in some cases, it can be both. Well, the question that many researchers want to ask is, so what kinds of communication, what communicative behaviors contribute to marital satisfaction, marital health, and marital success? Let's talk about 4 of them in this particular session. The first communicative behavior that contributes to marital success and satisfaction are what are called positivity or positive communication behavior. The idea is that oftentimes people will communicate in a particular way that sends a message to their spouse of assurance or a message of affection, such as I love you, or I value you, or I really appreciate you, or there's some kind of an assurance that everything is okay between the husband and the wife, or some kind of a message of appreciation, or some kind of recognition of someone's specialness in the eyes of the other person. All of these are what's known as positivity. They're positive communication behaviors. And in fact, of all the kinds of communication we'll talk about, positivity communication or positive communicative behaviors are easily the most important of all the communicative behaviors that contribute directly to marital satisfaction and marital success. Now, research does find that this is particularly important for females. So in a spousal context, wives are more likely to respond positively, are more likely to place value on these kinds of communication behaviors than our husbands. Not that they're not important to husbands. They are. They're just not as important. Now, this becomes crucial to understand because in the broader context of a marital relationship, it's important that these positivity behaviors are present. But we know from the research that these positivity behaviors are particularly important in the later years of marriage. Now, that's not to say that in the first 4 or 5 or 6 years of a marriage, they're unimportant. Far from it. But it's true that after you've been married for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, these positivity behaviors become even more important. Now, why would that be? Well, most of the research says they're more important in the later years of marriage because by those later marriage years, you've established a baseline, a pattern of communication. And the positivity assurances, if they are woven into that pattern of communication, are likely to carry the marriage through the inevitable ups and downs that come the longer you've been married. Now, that, of course, raises the question, well, what counts as positive communication? And the answer to that is to be found as we discuss the remaining kinds of behaviors that we'll discuss in this particular session. So the second communicative behavior that we need to talk about that is clearly correlated with marital satisfaction and marital success are what are known as conversational ranges. Conversational range refers to this idea that you and your spouse discuss a broad variety of kinds of topics. So you might talk about politics, and you might talk about entertainment, you might talk about your kids, you might talk about what happened at your job, you might talk about what's going on in the neighborhood. If you talk about all these things and do so on a rather regular basis, you have a broad conversational range. If, on the other hand, you don't talk about those kinds of topics, you have a narrow conversational range. And the research finds the broader your conversational range, the more likely it is that that's going to have a positive effect and contribute to marital satisfaction and marital success. Now, why would that be? Well, one reason for that is because conversational range oftentimes is a way of affirming that the two of you have a number of things in common. If you can talk about a broad variety of topics, it affirms this idea that there are multiple ties between you and your spouse. Second of all, the conversational range oftentimes allows an opportunity for you to continue to get to know your spouse. After all, to be married for a number of years, and I've been married for over 30, is to go on a life journey with your spouse. And across that life journey, people will change and shift, and it's important to get to know each other, not afresh, but to get to know each other more deeply as the years go on. Well, conversational range allows for that to happen. Now, it doesn't really matter whether that expansion of conversational range is steady or whether it's abrupt. The more important consideration is that it occurs. So perhaps ideally, a steady conversational range would mean that the longer you're married, the more topics you talk about. But it's also fair to say that from the research that even if that conversational range expands only in fits and starts, then that is equally good. So imagine a husband and a wife that have a conversational range in the first few years of marriage. They talk about a lot of stuff, but after a while, it seems like they talk about the same things over and over again. They get stuck, in a sense, in their conversational range. But then they get away for a romantic weekend, or the kids leave the house and the nest is empty, and all of a sudden the range expands. So that abrupt expansion of range can yield almost the same kinds of positive benefits as the more steady expansion of conversational range that might occur over a longer period of time. So one of the things we find then is that this conversational range becomes the type of thing that you have to be intentional about. In fact, all communicative behaviors we'll discuss both in this session and in the next one are the kinds of things you have to work at. You have to intend to put into your marital relationship. The conversational range in particular is of this variety. Now, why would that be? Well, because people are creatures of habit, and because as we fall into patterns of communication, baselines of communication, it sometimes can be difficult to break out of them. And so conversational range becomes the kind of thing that allows you to break out of that rut. And conversational range becomes the kind of thing that serves as an antidote to things getting stale. And so conversational range has been clearly correlated in the research with marital satisfaction and marital success. Now, before we press on, let me say just a couple of words about some of the terminology that I'm using both in this session and in subsequent sessions. When we talk about marital satisfaction, we're talking about the extent to which people feel satisfied in the marriage. That is to say, they're happy, they're content, they have a positive feeling toward their spouse and toward the marriage in general. They're satisfied with things. It's like a meal. You have a meal that you enjoy, you feel satisfied. Marital success, on the other hand, is the likelihood that the marriage continues on. Marital success refers to this idea that you're divorced or not, you're separated or not, you're together or not. And by together, we mean not just in a legal sense, but also together in the sense that the marriage is working, that it is a successful, ongoing marriage. You're not just staying together for the kids. You're not just staying together because your religion prohibits you from getting a divorce. You're not just staying together because it would crush your parents. No, the marriage really is working. Now, marital satisfaction and marital success are, of course, related to one another. Satisfaction does contribute to success, and successful marriages tend to be those where people are satisfied. But they're not always related in that way. And so the research, therefore, wants to look at how communication influences one or both of those two considerations. Now, occasionally, I'll also make reference to a healthy marriage. A healthy marriage, or marital health, is this concept that refers to the extent to which there are detrimental or positive dynamics that are present in a marriage. So, for example, a healthy marriage is one in which there are very few destructive, harmful types of dynamics that are present in the marriage. So let me give you an example. Typically, extreme levels of lying and deception or verbal abuse are good indicators of an unhealthy kind of marriage. The presence of those communicative behaviors are unhealthy. It threatens marriages. It's not good. And so therefore we might say that this particular couple over here has an unhealthy marriage because the two of them lie to each other on such a regular basis that no one knows whether they're telling the truth. Or this person over here acts out with such hostility and such passive aggression and belittles and talks down to the spouse that we can say that that is an indication of an unhealthy marriage. And so marital satisfaction, marital health, and marital success are three concepts in the research that are outcomes. They are effects, oftentimes, of the kind of communication that occurs. Well, with that pause, let's go back and talk about the two remaining factors that contribute to marital satisfaction, marital success. And there are two large ones, so let's talk about them. Self-disclosure is absolutely crucial to marital success and marital health. A general rule of thumb is that the more someone discloses in the context of a marriage, the more likely it is that both partners are going to find satisfaction in that marriage. Or to put it differently, most of the research draws a positive correlation such that as self-disclosure rises, so also does the satisfaction of the people involved in the marriage. Now, this is especially true for females, as there is a wide variety of research that finds that wives place higher value on self-disclosure than do husbands. Again, not to say it's not important to husbands, just to say that wives, comparatively, place a higher value on it. Now, we'll talk more in greater detail in a few moments about what we mean by that kind of disclosure, but I want to put that idea on a shelf for right now and come back to it because self-disclosure is one of the areas in the family communication research where we see a wider gender difference than practically any other area. Or to put it differently, self-disclosure is one of the few areas where it seems to matter much more to one of the two sexes. So having said that, the question then arises, well, what do we mean exactly by self-disclosure? Well, get out of your head the idea that self-disclosure means you're burying your deepest, darkest secrets. That's not what it means at all. In fact, most researchers tend to put self-disclosure into one of two categories: mundane disclosure and serious disclosure. So mundane disclosure can be as simple as me getting home from work and sharing with my wife what happened during the day. Or mundane disclosure can be two people talking about what happened in the world today and sharing their opinions about it. Serious disclosure, on the other hand, is that kind of vulnerability, that kind of sharing of feelings, that kind of opening up a part of yourself that maybe no one else but your spouse sees. It's called serious because compared to the mundane disclosure, it tends to strike a little closer to home. It deals more with our vulnerabilities, our securities, our self-concept, and all that kind of a thing. And so what we find then is that regardless of whether we're talking about the serious or the non-serious kind of disclosure, any kind of disclosure in general is still related to marital satisfaction and still related in the same way. The more of it that there is, mundane or serious, the more someone is likely to be satisfied in their marriage. Now, one of the things we know is that self-disclosure does not always naturally occur. In fact, most of the research finds that self-disclosure is most likely to occur when dedicated space or time is made for it. So, for example, one common form of self-disclosure is what is called the daily debriefing. The daily debriefing is when two spouses will talk about what happened at their day as they sit down at dinner, or as they watch television, or as they take a walk in the evening, or as they text back and forth, or as they FaceTime if it happens to be a long-distance kind of marital relationship. This daily debriefing, though it often represents a mundane kind of communication, is a really good example of how people make a dedicated space for it. So, for example, I know of a family that as they gather together at the dinner table, they will play the game of high-low. What was the high point of your day? What was the low point of your day? So by asking that open-ended question, they're inviting both the spouse and in some cases the kids to talk about their day. This becomes a kind of daily debriefing, but in the broader view, it is exactly a kind of self-disclosure that would not likely have occurred if a dedicated space and time had not been carved out for it. Now, on that point, the question is, well, if you force someone to self-disclose, is that going to have the same kind of positive benefits? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Forced self-disclosure doesn't have the same kinds of benefits. Comparatively speaking, the spontaneous, natural kind of self-disclosure is preferable to forced self-disclosure, but forced self-disclosure is still better than no self-disclosure. The risk you run with forced self-disclosure is a building of resentment. And of course, resentment is one of those unhealthy dynamics that you don't want in any marriage. Now, research finds that most married couples tend to fall into an acceptance pattern when it comes to self-disclosure. So remember earlier I mentioned how the wife might have these expectations about how the husband would support her or how the husband would share everything with her. So if the husband doesn't do that, if the husband shares less than what she would expect, then she's faced with a choice to accept that or not to accept it. Let's just say that she accepts it. Let's just say that she doesn't badger him about it. Let's just say that she allows him to not share that with her without it causing a problem. That means that the husband and wife are likely to fall into this pattern of acceptance whereby she would like this much self-disclosure, but she's settling for that much. And the research suggests that most couples fall into this pattern where they accept some level of self-disclosure. The question, of course, is that level of self-disclosure that you're accepting, is it good for you? Is it what you would want? Is it okay for you to settle for that level of self-disclosure? If the answer is yes, then the research suggests that things are likely to be okay. But if the answer is no, then the research suggests that it's likely not to be okay. Now, all this talk about self-disclosure might scare some people, in particular males, who believe that a big part of the communicative interactions must be self-disclosive. Well, that's not the case at all. Ideally, the self-disclosure would occur in the natural ebb and flow of any marital relationship. It's just baked in to the marital relationship. But the fact of the matter is that even in the happiest of marriages, self-disclosure does not dominate the marital relationship. Instead, as I said a moment ago, it occurs spontaneously and naturally to a level that everyone would accept. What we find, however, is that self-disclosure becomes especially important in a couple of situations. One of which is when we expect self-disclosure. So if there's a particular situation like getting home from work or talking about how your relationship with your parents used to be, then that disclosure becomes particularly important. Now, of course, those scenarios are highly idiosyncratic and will vary from one couple to the next. The second type of situation in which self-disclosure becomes very important is when it carries a kind of meta-message. Now, a meta-message is a message that stands behind the message. It's much like that relational level of communication we talked about when we contrasted that with the content level of communication. Sometimes the disclosure sends a message to something or someone else. So, for example, imagine a husband whose last parent has passed away. And so in the midst of the grief process, his wife would like him to disclose about how he feels regarding that. So in that particular moment, there not only is this expectation, which was the first idea, but more importantly, there's a meta-message here. The wife wants to know if the husband trusts her enough to share with the wife the grief that he's feeling over the loss of his last parent. And so if the husband doesn't choose to disclose, then the meta-message is sent that I don't trust you with that grief, or we're not close enough that I feel like I can open up and share that grief with you. Now, never mind the fact that that might not be true, the risk is run of the wife perceiving that. And so in that particular context, given that expectation, it's important for the husband to either A, do the disclosure, or B, explain why the disclosure will not be forthcoming and allow that explanation to be sufficient in the wife's eyes to accept that non-disclosure. I said earlier that it's particularly important for wives to have a sense that their husbands are self-disclosing to them. And that still is the case even in this part of the session. But let me amplify on that just a little bit. One of the things we know is that females more often exhibit what we call a cyclical effect. That is to say, the self-disclosure triggers this kind of rush or expansion of a perception of closeness or intimacy. So when a husband self-discloses to the wife, there's this increase in the wife's perception that the two of them have connected, that the two of them are close. This in turn tends to fuel further self-disclosure on the wife's part. Husbands, on the other hand, don't experience that same type of cyclical effect. It's not as if the disclosure rises and then falls, rises and then falls. Instead, husbands tend to illustrate what's called a prodding effect. Now, the metaphor of a prodding effect is a large instrument used to poke cattle to get them to go do something, to move out of the way or to head toward the barn. A prodding effect is this idea that husbands oftentimes will disclose to some level but then stop until prodded to disclose to a higher level. Or to put it differently, there less often is intrinsically motivated disclosure and more often extrinsically motivated disclosure. So in this particular kind of an example, in order for the husband to talk about the grief he's experiencing over the loss of his last parent, he's likely to need to be prodded by the wife to do so. Now, how she does that, when she does that, how frequently she does that is idiosyncratic. And ideally, this husband and wife would find a way for her to prod him in a way that is healthy and effective. So if space has been made, for example, to do self-disclosure, then there's not much need for prodding. It's kind of a natural, baked into the marriage prodding. But on the other hand, most husbands typically need some prodding to do the self-disclosure. And so those two differences in effects of self-disclosure need to be understood. Also, there's research with respect to self-disclosure that finds that happily married couples, in fact, do tend to do that debriefing at the end of the day that I talked about a moment ago. That mundane self-disclosure has been found to be absolutely positively related to marital satisfaction and to marital success. In fact, this is not a self-help class, but if I could offer one piece of advice relative to disclosure that's very easily attainable for most married couples, it would be to fall into the habit of doing the daily debriefing. Finally, it must be said that because there are two people involved in a marriage, that raises the question of equity, of whether the husband and wife are each self-disclosing to the same extent that the other is. Now, earlier we talked about a lens through which to see communication, which was this notion of equity and how much you're investing in the relationship. Self-disclosure becomes one of the ways that people make those investments in their relationships. And as you might imagine, most of the research finds that generally speaking, the happiest couples with the most satisfying marriages are those marriages where the husband and the wife demonstrate what's called disclosive congruency, meaning that they're disclosing at about the same level. Or to put it differently, if the wife is disclosing this much and the husband this much, that's not congruent. In fact, it's unbalanced. She's making more of an investment than he is. And so we would expect that marital relationship to be more stressed, or at least to be at greater risk of stress, than we would a marital relationship where it looks more like this. The two of them are more congruent. Now again, it's idiosyncratic, and so a particular couple over here might have a very different kind of a pattern, and they're happy, than this couple over there, and they're also happy. But generally speaking, this congruency of disclosure becomes particularly important. And then we want to talk about two more ideas as we wrap up this session. Another idea that is clearly related to marital satisfaction has to do with nonverbal cues. Now, so often when we think about communication in a marriage, we think about verbal communication, as for example with the husband self-disclosing to the wife. But nonverbal cues in the research have also been found to be very important relative to marital satisfaction and marital success. In fact, there's research that finds that the ability to accurately decode nonverbal cues is crucial to marital satisfaction and marital success. Now, accurately decoding nonverbal cues is important because other research finds that upwards of 90% of a message's impact is to be found non-verbally, not verbally. Or to put it differently, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And the how you say it part often refers to the nonverbal cues. So those marriages that are the most satisfying and often the most successful are those marriages where the husbands and wives have been able to get to a point where they're accurately reading or decoding one another's nonverbal cues. Now, unfortunately, this puts husbands at a bit of a deficiency. Research suggests that comparatively speaking, females are much better at accurately reading and interpreting nonverbal cues, at least compared to males. And so therefore, despite the importance of the accuracy of interpreting nonverbal cues, husbands will have to work at it a little harder than will wives. One of the things we understand about nonverbal cues and why they're so important is that if a husband and wife are able to accurately decode the nonverbal cues, that serves as an affirmation that they get one another. It serves as an affirmation that the two of them have this communicative connection, that they're on the same wavelength, so to speak. And so, in the broader sense, earlier I mentioned congruency, and I talked narrowly about this disclosive congruency. But a much larger concept is communicative congruency, this idea that husbands and wives, generally speaking, communicate in congruent manners. So in this particular case, if husbands and wives are able to accurately decode the nonverbal cues that each of them uses, then that demonstrates communicative congruency. They're on the same page of the playbook, as it says. So, for example, one of the things we know that eye contact is very important as a nonverbal cue. In fact, there's research that finds that eye contact, the making and keeping of eye contact in a marital setting, is important. Why would that be? I mean, it seems like such a simple, small thing of making eye contact, because that type of nonverbal cue is reaffirming the connection that people have. And in fact, most of the research finds that nonverbal cues are used to reaffirm what people already sense or feel. There's also research to find that if forced to believe either the nonverbal cues or what's said verbally, husbands and wives are more likely to decode or to point to the nonverbal cues. So let me give you an example of that. If you think about smiling, it's possible to have a genuine smile, and it's possible to have a fake smile. Researchers have actually studied, in a laboratory setting, this idea of true versus fake smiles. And one of the things they find is that if spouses consistently give one another fake smiles, if there's a relative lack of genuine smiles in a marital relationship, that becomes a pretty good indicator that there's some kind of distress or difficulty in the marital relationship. And so that's another example of a very small nonverbal thing that's either affirming or not affirming that a husband and wife are on the same page, so to speak. And so it's impossible to identify every single nonverbal cue that might be present in any marriage, let alone one marriage compared to the next marriage or the next. And so therefore the research doesn't spend a lot of time slogging around in particular nonverbal cues. Instead, it simply wants to say that an awareness of the nonverbal cues, or how you say things, becomes particularly important. Now, with that as a backdrop, let me make one last observation about nonverbal cues. There are all kinds of ways to communicate nonverbally. There's body language, there's facial expression, there's tone of voice, there's eye contact, there's smiling, all that kind of a thing. Tone of voice in particular has been found to be related to marital satisfaction and marital success. What I mean by that is that spouses typically are reading or interpreting tone of voice more quickly than almost any other kind of nonverbal cue. And the reason for that is because so oftentimes we say things in an unguarded manner in our family settings. You might recall from one of the earlier sessions we talked about sloppiness in family communication. Well, one way that we oftentimes are sloppy in our family communication is that we sometimes will say things offhandedly and accompany them with a kind of nonverbal cue that very clearly lays bare how we really feel about something. And so it's no surprise that husbands and wives would read these nonverbal cues very quickly and come to a conclusion about how they are to take what was just said to them. Or in other words, while you certainly have to be careful how you say things, the tone of voice becomes particularly important with respect to how you say things. And finally, at the end of this particular session, let's talk about what are called tie signs, T-I-E signs. A tie sign is some kind of an outward-facing demonstration of the connection between a husband and a wife. A tie sign can be considered a public display of affection. A tie sign can be a public expression of commitment. A tie sign can be a public reaffirmation of togetherness. It can be as simple as a husband and wife holding hands as they walk into a restaurant. It can be as simple as a hug that is given as the wife steps on an airplane to go on a business trip. The key is that they are typically nonverbal or typically symbolic. They're not necessarily verbalized. They could be, but more often than not, they're nonverbal or they are symbolic. Now, one of the things we find is that these tie signs are incredibly idiosyncratic. They vary both in terms of nature, in terms of frequency, in any marriage. But the reality is that the most successful and most satisfying marriages have some set of agreed upon tie signs. It can be as simple as always agreeing to say I love you to one another as you go to bed at night. It can be as simple as always making sure you hold hands as you drive down the road, but these habitual kinds of tie signs communicate outwardly to your spouse or to anyone that sees you that the two of you have a connection. Now, ironically, one of the things we find is that tie signs become particularly important in the early years of a marriage. You might expect them to be more important later on in the marriage when things have kind of gotten routine and maybe a little stale, but that's not the case. In fact, the research finds that in the first 2 or 3 years of marriage, tie signs become particularly important. Now, why would that be? Well, the research would say that tie signs are important in the early years of marriage because those early years feature the need for reaffirmation. Why? Because you're establishing a pattern. Or to put it differently, the tie signs, if they're going to be baked into a relationship, would need to be baked in, so to speak, in the early years of a relationship. So that way they stick. And so therefore the tie signs become important as setting kind of a reaffirmation habit of this marital relationship. One of the things we also know is that changes in the patterns of tie signs can be a really good indicator of changes in the marriage. Or to put it differently, changes in the marriage precede changes in the tie sign. So if a husband and wife always used to hold hands as they drove down the road, and now they no longer do, that's probably an indication of something having changed in the marriage. Now, the key is to figure out whether that's just sloppiness, whether that's just people not paying attention to the nonverbal cues in the way they used to, or if it generally suggests some kind of a dissatisfaction or disenchantment with the person you've chosen to marry. While there's wisdom in trying to discern that, it's important work for husbands and wives to do to go about the process of discerning that. And so, whether it's tie signs or nonverbal cues or disclosure or the positive kinds of things we talked about previously, the reality is that certain kinds of communicative behavior are related to the success and the satisfaction that husbands and wives find in their marriage. And so in subsequent sessions, we'll talk more about the other factors that are related to marital satisfaction. And I think you'll find that there are quite a lot of them. And so that's a positive thing because it means that many things are within your control. And so we'll explore those in subsequent sessions.